Welcome to worship and thanks for inviting us into your home. I'm Kip Rosen, one of the pastors here. It's great to have you join us today. Have you ever experienced a flood? Back in 1997, Grand Forks, North Dakota, along with Fargo, Moorhead area, had the worst flood in their history. It was a combination of rising river water and also overland flooding as the water from snowmelt did not drain away. Temporary dikes had been constructed along the Red River and around the edges of town, but the river continued to rise. And on April 18th, this is 26 years ago, the dikes at Grand Forks failed, flooding thousands of homes. The mayor ordered the evacuation of more than 50,000 people, most of the population of the city. I read it was the largest evacuation in the United States since the evacuation of residents in Atlanta, Georgia during the Civil War. Some homeowners could not get back to their damaged properties until May, 2 weeks later. Well, I was able to travel to Grand Forks in early May that year to help for a few days with cleanup at the Zion United Methodist Church in Grand Forks. The church was in a neighborhood surrounded by homes. And when we got there, each home had a pile of wet furniture, TVs, boxes, magazines, sheetrocks, stuffed animals, toys, etc., etc. A lot of memories piled up all along the length of the curbs. Pastor Doug Deal said a few weeks prior they had to slow down at intersections because the piles of snow were so high you couldn't see around them. And now it was because of the junk from basements piled so high you could not see down the street. The church had had 6 feet of water in the basement, and it was assumed all the houses suffered the same fate. The church basement had been pumped dry by the time we got there, and so we worked basically to gut the basement of the church down to the wooden studs. We removed all the wet drywall, that's an oxymoron. We hauled it outside, we took down the ceiling tiles that were removed, a lot of work. And Doug Deal, the pastor, helped us each morning, and then in the afternoon he would go visit church members. They were trying to figure out if people were in town, what was the condition of their homes, how they were doing. And I asked Doug, how's it going? And he said, well, you know, things aren't right when an old stoic German farmer starts crying and gives you a hug. Well, they had worship that Sunday. It was held outside on a beautiful day, and Doug told a story of when he was a young boy. He remembered the first time he ever ran the toilet over. He said he didn't even know that was possible, but it happened right before his eyes. The water kept running, it kept rising. He didn't know what to do. He watched in horror as it approached the top of the toilet bowl, and he listened as it began to cascade over the top, splashing like a waterfall onto the bathroom floor. And it still didn't stop. What was he going to do? He joked that even back then he was an incredibly lucid and quick thinker, so he gathered up some linoleum samples his dad had brought home from work, and he began to build a dike, hoping to catch the water before it reached the bathroom door. It was not a bad-looking dam, and he said it worked for a while, but the water continued to come, and his dike was not all that tall. And he said he still remembered the feeling of frustration at the lack of control he had as he watched the water flow over the dike he had built. It's tough feeling out of control when we think we have everything under control. And so it was with the flood in Grand Forks. Doug used that story from his childhood to relate a small piece of the disaster of the flood. It was horrible, tragic, painful, deadly. Anyone with experience of a flood could tell you the same. Tragic. So why is it when we think about the story of Noah and the flood, we think of it as a cute children's story from the Bible? Barb and I were watching 2 of our grandsons the other night, and they asked us to read a couple stories from their children's Bible. Do you know what's on the cover of their children's Bible? It's a picture depicting Noah and the ark. The floodwaters are now a stream and waterfall. The ark has landed. The happy elephants, lions, monkeys, butterflies, and others are leaving the ark smiling. A dove with an olive branch is flying. The sky is clear and bright. It is a happy scene. It's what you would expect for children. In our children's nursery here at Asbury, we have a mural of a scene of Noah and the ark and animals painted by Linda Van Loo. There's also a frame painting she made on the wall with a similar scene. We think of it as a children's story. And yet the story of Noah and the flood is a story about a terrible, horrible, painful tragedy. Anyone or anything not on the ark met their end. Everyone on earth died except Noah and his family. Women, children, men, babies, every creature on earth died except those on the ark. You don't put that scene on a children's book. In order to make it a kid-friendly story, we have to minimize the details, and we turn the story into a celebration of Noah's goodness and faithfulness, or the idea that God provides a rescue for Noah and his family. That's part of the story, but it fails to account for the driving factor behind the story: human violence. The story is too long to read today in the time we have, but you can find it in Genesis 6, 7, 8, and into chapter 9. And there are really a couple versions of the story that are intertwined in the Bible. Many of you know the story, but let me summarize some of the background and the basics of the story. The Bible begins with the story about creation, and again, there are a couple versions of the creation story found in Genesis 1 and 2. But God creates the world and everything in it, and the story tells us something about God. It lets us know something about humans and about the relationship between God and people. It's not a story about history, it's a story about meaning and purpose. And the story begins with a watery chaos, and God brings order and creation out of it. God separates the waters. God puts the dome in the sky to separate the waters above from the waters below. And step by step, everything is created, and it is good, God says. People are very good. But what happens? Here's a trivia question that Josh Scott shares in his book, Bible Stories for Grown-Ups. When is sin first mentioned in the narrative of the Bible? Now, most people would immediately think sin enters the story in Genesis chapter 3 when the humans eat the forbidden fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. People have been given free will to choose and decide, and they choose to eat the forbidden fruit. And their eyes are open, they realize they're naked, they hide from God. And here's the interesting thing. The word sin never occurs in that story, Genesis chapter 3. It's not there. If you read the text in Hebrew, the word sin does not show up until chapter 4. And do you know what happens in chapter 4 of Genesis? It's the story of Cain killing his brother Abel. The two brothers are offering their sacrifices to God. Cain has his crops and Abel has his flocks that they are offering. And for some reason, we're not told why, Abel's sacrifice is acceptable to God, but Cain's was not. That rejection made Cain angry and resentful. And then God comes to Cain with a warning. The Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry, and why has your countenance fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is lurking at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must master it." That's from Genesis 4, 6, and 7. You know that sin enters the story with this warning from God about Cain's anger and resentment and what it will produce if they're not tended to. God warns that sin is trying to take hold of Cain. Sin is lurking at the door. You might picture a snake ready to strike, or a cat getting ready to pounce on a mouse. And here's what happens next. Cain said to his brother Abel, "Let us go out to the field." Let's go out to the field. You know this is not going to end well, right? When they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. Genesis 4:8. In the story, sin is connected to and rooted in human violence. Sin wants to master Cain, and sin gets what it wants here. And from there, human violence escalates. It seems that each generation gets worse. The earth is full of human violence. As humorist Will Rogers once wrote, "God made man a little lower than angels, and man has been getting lower ever since." Or as Mark Twain put it, "Man is the creature made at the end of the week's work when God was tired." And Twain said, "This explains everything." You see, it was risky for God to create people with the ability to choose. I guess God didn't want us to be puppets. But within 6 chapters, it has gotten so bad that God wishes the world had never been created. God regrets creating people. So God decides to destroy everything, to start over. Saul Lieberman, who is a professor of the Talmud, the Jewish scriptures, once asked another professor to choose the most tragic character in the Bible. The professor named some prophets like Jeremiah or Ezekiel, and Professor Lieberman disagreed with all the choices. And he said that God is the most tragic figure in the Bible. And as evidence, he pointed to the fact that in the beginning, God had declared creation to be very good. But only a few generations later, by the time of Noah, God was so troubled over humanity's corruption that God regretted creating humans in the first place. God was so disappointed in humanity that God decided, wipe the slate clean, start over again. And God sent the great flood to destroy all life on the earth. God's heart must have surely been broken. Tragic. Except God decided to save a remnant. Noah and his family, as well as 2 of every kind of animal on the earth. And the story's different in the Bible on how many animals go on. But the point is, God allowed a remnant to be saved, to remain. And this is important. God never gives up hope on God's beloved people. You and I would have given up. We would decide to cut the losses, walk away, and conclude that humanity is just hopeless. But not God. Francis Thompson called God the hound of heaven who pursues us down the labyrinthine ways. You know, regardless of how far we run away from God and God's love, God remains in pursuit. That story tells us something about God, something about us as humans, something about our relationship with God and with one another. And it's not a story about history, it's about meaning and purpose. And through the story, our ancestors of the faith, they're seeking to understand God and what's our place in relationship to creation and God. Well, Noah obeyed God's instructions and built the ark. He gathered the animals and his family, and they entered the ark just before the flood began. For 40 days and 40 nights, the rain fell upon the earth, and the flood waters covered everything. It's really a picture of the reversal of creation. That dome that in the sky that separated the waters above and below, that's removed. Waters came from above and up from below, and creation's reversed. Everything is wiped out from the face of the earth. Tragic. Genesis 7 says, "And all flesh died that moved on the earth. Birds, domestic animals, wild animals, all swarming creatures that swarm on the earth, and all human beings, everything on dry land in whose nostrils was the breath of life, died." That's from Genesis 7. And the ark floated on the water for many months until the flood waters receded, and the ark came to rest on a mountain. When Noah and his family and the animals finally left the ark, God made a covenant with Noah. God promised never again to destroy the earth with a flood, and God set a rainbow in the sky as a sign of the promise. I think of that rainbow as a warrior hanging up his bow and arrows as a sign there'll be no more violence, no more destruction of the whole world with a flood. Genesis 9 reads, "I establish my covenant with you that never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of a flood, and never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth." That's from Genesis 9:11. See, that story tells us something about God, something about us as humans, and something about our relationship with God and with one another. It's not a story about history, it's about meaning and purpose. And through the story, our ancestors in the faith are seeking to understand God and our place in God's creation. And they might have a more limited perspective of God since they don't have God in the flesh and Jesus to show them and teach them, but they're seeking to understand who God is. Lilias Trotter, who was an artist and missionary in North Africa in the 19th century, tells the story of a girl named Melha. One day Lilias watched Melha go to her father, and her father was almost blind at that point. And Melha pointed to a picture on the wall. It was a picture of Jesus calling a little child to him. And Melha said to her father, "Father, look at Jesus." Her father, who was almost blind, said, "I have no eyes, O my daughter. I cannot see." But this did not faze the imaginative child. Melha lifted her eyes to the picture and said, "Oh, Jesus, look at Father." And Lilias Trotter concluded her story saying, "Was that not a bit of heavenly wisdom? Even when we feel lost, unseen, and insufficient to know God's grace, God sees us and offers us healing. God cares when we're in pain and hurt by others. Though we often face injustice in this world, God's healing and compassion will prevail for eternity." Reminds me of the old story of the young girl who lived with her family on the edge of a large forest. One day she wandered into the woods to explore, but she lost her way. Darkness fell. In desperation, she ran screaming this way and then that way, and finally her legs gave out and her throat went hoarse, and she fell asleep exhausted in a small clearing. Meanwhile, her parents were beside themselves with worry. They're searching the forest, calling her name. Neighbors helped comb the woods. No one could find the girl. And by the middle of the night, most folks returned to their homes, but not the girl's father. He scoured the woods looking for his daughter. He called her name. He called her name. He called for her, hoping for the best, fearing for the worst. And as the sun crested the horizon, he stumbled upon that clearing where his daughter was slept. And he raced toward her, calling out her name, and the little girl woke up. And when she saw her father, she ran to meet him, shouting with joy, "Daddy, oh Daddy, I found you! I found you!" Well, who finds who? In the story of Noah and the flood, we catch a glimpse of a God whose heart breaks for a lost humanity. God wants to wipe everything out and start over. And yet, God has hope. Maybe Noah and his family can bring change. So even in the midst of judgment, we see a glimpse of hope, love, grace. Max Lucado, in his book A Gentle Thunder, talks about the love of a mom for a newborn baby. He writes, "Your baby didn't even tell you she was coming. She just came, and what a coming. She rendered you a barbarian. You screamed, you swore, you bit bullets and tore the sheets, and now look at you. Your back aches, your head pounds, your body is drenched in sweat, every muscle is strained and stretched. You should be angry, but are you? Far from it. On your face is a for longer than ever love. She has done nothing for you, and yet you love her. She's brought pain to your body and nausea to your mourning, yet you treasure her. Her face is wrinkled and her eyes dim, yet all you can talk about are her good looks and bright future. She's going to wake you up every night for the next 6 weeks, but that doesn't matter. I can see it on your face. You're crazy about her." And Lucado concludes, that's the way God felt about Israel and us. Why did God choose to save Noah? Well, according to Genesis, he was the only righteous man left in the world. That's kind of depressing. The only righteous man. But notice this. The story of Noah has an ironic twist. After the waters subside and Noah leaves the ark, do you remember what Noah does? He falls into kind of a cheap sin that might have brought God's disappointment or even wrath under other circumstances, but Noah got drunk and lay naked in his tent. Now, this is a no-no in Jewish culture, a disgrace, disobedience. Do you see the irony in this story? God chooses the only righteous man on earth, and he turns out to be not so completely righteous after all. And isn't that where the story began? God is disappointed with humanity, We're lost. We're broken. But fortunately, that's not the end of the story. The waters recede, and God puts a rainbow in the heavens as a sign of eternal grace. God makes a covenant with humanity. Never again will God send great floods to destroy the earth. There is hope. There is promise. There's grace. And on the cross of Calvary, God makes a new covenant through Jesus. A covenant that says that those who receive and believe in Christ will never die. The power of sin and death are defeated. We have free will. We can choose. And sometimes our choices cause us to stumble and fall. But God never gives up on us. God's love will never fail us. Remember that the next time you see a rainbow.